Welcome back and happy May 27th, 2021. Robin Absarian, a columnist for the Los Angeles Times, opines her latest thus, quote, "What is so terrifying to Republicans about the reassessment of American history known as critical race theory? Once an obscure academic theory, it has now taken its place alongside face masks and cancel culture as the bugaboo of conservatives who would rather do anything other than fix our broken immigration system, crumbling infrastructure, and inadequate health care. Pioneered in the 1970s and 80s and refined as the decades have passed, the theory posits that racial inequality is a baked-in feature of American institutions, which benefits what author Isabel Wilkerson calls the dominant caste, i.e., white people. Republicans, most of them white, are outraged at the suggestion." Close quote. At the same time, we read in The Guardian from a legal scholar and Nation magazine columnist, quote, "At this vexed moment, it is a truism that Americans of different races, ethnicities, and religions are tense, wary of one another, but it is white fear of blackness that has the longest history, that is the most intractable, and that still underwrites majoritarian tendencies to forgive even lethal police misconduct and to rationalize punitive forms of segregation in housing, education, and employment," close quote. Where to begin? Let's begin calling things by their proper name. In this case, lies. Toxic lies, Marxist lies, deliberate lies to serve cause of inhuman destruction in the name of progressivism. Let's sort it out seriatim. First, when the author writes, critical race theory has now taken its place alongside face masks and cancel culture as the bugaboo of conservatives. Well, if one wanted to make face masks political, there are few better ways to do so than say they are a bugaboo of conservatives. Or, as the president put it, your patriotic duty to wear, in, by the way, the same speech he was explaining what we could and could not do on the 4th of July. Cancel culture? A bugaboo? Quick, name me a liberal who has been canceled for writing or saying something liberals approve of, including comparing Republicans and Americans to Adolf Hitler. You cannot. I can spend the rest of the time allotted to this monologue, however, detailing cancellations of conservatives. You can wish it away or try to hide it, but as in Richard III, "Say I slew them not," and the Queen replied, "Then say they were not slain, but dead they are. Say there is no border crisis, but crisis there is. Say there is no cancellation of conservatives, but cancel culture there is." She says immigration, healthcare, and infrastructure. Those are big topics, but not relevant here at all. Thus, just an example of bad or poor writing. A high school or 8th grade composition teacher would scratch those words out of this essay and write relevance, ? In the margin, if not just the word irrelevant. Anyway, happy to come back to those, but let's stick to the original thesis of hers. What is so terrifying to Republicans about the reassessment of American history and institutions seen through the lens which benefits what author Isabel Wilkerson calls the dominant caste, i.e. white people, close quote. Her words, dominant caste. Her words, white people. Our Los Angeles Times columnist says Republicans, most of them white, are outraged at looking into and studying this. Imagine that. Outrage at the notion that there is a racial caste system in America and that we're supposed to accept it. Before I say anything more about castes, let me just ask what side of the divide supports integration and what side antediluvian segregation. For one of the first facts or identifiers of a caste system by any acclaim is the essence of and importance of segregation, including intermarriage. So perhaps that's the strategy we see developing on the left. Take a toxic or previously toxic word, in this case caste system, ignore its true elements, in this case segregation, because they truly are your own and not your opponents, and ascribe that word, caste, to your opponents. In other words, scrub the meaning of it where it applies to you and just use its toxic reputation against your opponents who it doesn't apply to because you were the first to use it. We've been here before. We've seen this with autocrat. We've seen this with fascism. We've seen this with tyrant. We've seen this with comparisons to National Socialism's leaders, all invoked against conservatives, while the target is devoid of the characteristics, conservatives devoid of the characteristics the left, the proponents of such extreme language, ascribe to the target, us, we conservatives. Meanwhile, the traits of the emblem are at great home and comfort in the movements that invoke them against their opponents and enemies. If you want to think about caste systems and what defends them, it's actually the left trying to reinstitute them in America, not conservatives. And by the way, just by the way, when did it of a sudden become okay to declaim against and criticize the caste system, especially of India, which our author above invokes? I'm old enough to remember when we used to speak of universal rights and how the caste system was a violation of them. We were told that was racism against Indians, or ethnocentrism, or cultural superiority by Americans. We had no right to tell India that their behavior and their cultural experiences and rules and mores were enlightened or unenlightened. The rule has changed, I guess, when cultural appropriation and denigration can be elevated, at least to the level where it can be used to cudgel conservatives. Ironically, conservatives who hate and have long condemned the caste system, ironically, conservatives who have condemned it for decades only to be told that was culturally superior and ethnocentric. We were ahead of the game in condemning caste systems, and we were criticized when we did so. But none of this is really the most important thing here. The most important thing here is that, hell yeah, we Republicans and conservatives have a problem with teaching there is a caste in America, much less a white one or dominant one. Why do we have a problem with that? Oh, I don't know. Maybe because those who told us there was a caste system were slaveholders and leaders of the Confederacy who thought our founding was meant to expand slavery, while we conservatives and Republicans opposed that thinking in history all our lives? Oh, maybe because those who think there is or was a caste system in America were the leaders of the post-Civil War Jim Crow and segregation system. Anyone remember learning about a famous Supreme Court case called Plessy versus Ferguson? Ring a bell, Bill? Do you remember that? Plessy, it rings a bell to almost everyone who went through 8th grade or high school before 1998. It's probably one of 3 or 4 Supreme Court cases taught as early as the 8th grade. It's the case you may recall now that came to stand for and support the notion of separate but equal. You've heard the phrase separate but equal. It comes from Plessy versus Ferguson. It's a phrase of hypocrisy. It's a non sequitur of policy meant to enforce Jim Crow and segregation. It's a case that was uniformly taught as an embarrassment and departure from our history, ethics, and morality. Theoretically, Plessy versus Ferguson was finally overruled in Brown versus Board of Education, which once upon a time, up until yesterday really, was uniformly taught as the beginning of the new civil rights movement and lauded as a major step on the road to equal rights consonant with our Constitution and Declaration and Founders' best wishes. Today it's all quite cattywampus. In Plessy versus Ferguson, for example, we were taught the odiousness of racial categorization as the principle for determining rights and privileges, like riding in the same train as a fellow American or the same train car as a fellow American, but one whose race was different. And what we were not taught much at the time was that there was actually a dissent in the Plessy case. Perhaps dissents are too difficult for 8th and 12th graders to understand. I don't think so, but they rarely taught that there was a dissent in the Plessy case, and the dissent was written by one Justice John Marshall Harlan, and it is there that he wrote this, quote, "The white race deems itself to be the dominant race in this country, and perhaps it is in prestige, achievement, education, wealth, and power. So I doubt not it will continue to be for all time if it remains true to its great heritage and holds fast to the principles of constitutional liberty. But in view of the Constitution, in the eye of the law, there is in this country no superior, dominant, ruling class of citizens. There is no caste here. Our Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens. In respect of civil rights, all citizens are equal before the law. The humblest is the peer of the most powerful. The law regards man as man and takes no account of his surroundings or his color when his civil rights, as guaranteed by the supreme law of the land, are involved. It is therefore to be regretted that this high tribunal, the final expositor of the fundamental law of the land, has reached the conclusion that it is competent for a state to regulate the enjoyment by citizens of their civil rights solely upon the basis of race." Close quote. That, Miss Absarian, is why we hate the idea of teaching there is a dominant race and caste in America, and that it is white. We thought that notion died in the Declaration of Independence. If it did not, we thought it certainly would have after the Civil War. If it did not, then certainly with the ringing and beautiful words of John Marshall Harlan I just quoted. And that brought us to Brown versus Board of Education, because there was not a reckoning to Harlan's position just yet. And thus, in Brown versus Board of Education, Thurgood Marshall, arguing the case for the NAACP, wrote in his brief this, quote, "Distinctions by race are so evil, so arbitrary and invidious that a state bound to defend the equal protection of the laws must not invoke them in any public sphere," close quote. And while that case struck down segregation in education as unconstitutional, it did not explicitly and specifically adopt John Harlan's words. Too bad. As Harry Jaffa has written, there is not now and never has been any such difference between one human being and another human being or of whatever race or color, such that one is by nature the ruler of the other, as any human being is by nature the ruler of a dog or a horse. For this reason, legitimate political authority can arise only by the consent of the governed, and consent can never be given for any reason other than the equal protection of the rights of the governed. Hence, equal protection is the foundation of all constitutionalism, even apart from its specific inclusion in the Constitution itself. For more reasons than one, John Harlan's dissenting opinion ought to have been the opinion of the court in 1896. Even more, it ought to have been the opinion of the court in Brown versus Board of Education. But if you want to know why we don't buy into a caste system here in America, it's because we never have, and once upon a time, those who did so as a lament and lost cause effort to prove the Confederacy right. No thanks, Miss Absarian. All stick with Lincoln. As our legal scholar at the Nation wrote, quote, "At this vexed moment it is true that Americans of all different races, ethnicities, and religions are tense, wary of one another, but it is white fear of blackness that has the longest history, that is most intractable, and that still underwrites the Majorian tendencies to forgive even lethal police misconduct and to rationalize punitive forms of segregation in housing, education, and employment." Close quote. Such fear, I assume, as was represented in an African-American candidate for president becoming president twice, with a higher percentage of the white vote than any other white Democrat in recent memory, or for that matter, a higher percentage of the white vote than the beau ideal of the white Anglo-Protestant George H.W. Bush? And of course, as if the vexing moment we are in was a result of conservatives or Republicans elevating issues of race as badges of competence and incompetence, decent and indecent. But the idea that white fear of black aggression explains lethal police conduct is the most vile of lies, so vile that it is the exact, not figurative, but exact opposite of the truth. There would be no stories, none, of lethal shootings by police of unarmed black men if black men were not taught that the police are their natural and permanent enemy, and routinely misdescribed and slandered as animals and worse. If, in other words, there were no violent resistances to arrest, there would be more people alive, especially the ones whose memories were invoked to sell a Marxist ideology that wants to exacerbate the problems of poverty and violence and family structure in the name of bringing heaven on earth in a Marxist paradise. But let's be clear, it's not unfounded white fear of black that is the cause of anything here in America, but thanks to you, left, there is unfounded black fear of whites. So you've perpetrated a double lie. You want to go ahead and resurrect and reinstitute Plessy versus Ferguson? That's a you thing. I'll stick with the notion that it was a horrible, envenomed decision. So when equality and safety are threatened, and threatened not by democratic but Marxist alternatives, and you want to turn not only the clock but the moral dictionary upside down on civil rights, again, sorry for the French, but hell yeah, we're terrified. I'm Seth Leibson. We'll be right back.